Your speaker today is Jim Plaxco. He's the president of the Chicago Society for Space Studies, serves as director of information systems and a data protection officer for the National Space Society. He also serves as NASA JPL Solar System Ambassador and as a NSS Space Ambassador, and is the economic subject matter expert for the NSS Space Ambassadors Program. I'll turn it over to him for this very interesting talk that I've been looking forward to. Take it away.
Great. Okay, thank you. And I'm going to just start by sharing off my screen here with everybody. So hopefully everyone is looking at the factors impacting the sustainability of a cislunar economy. I don't blame the Moon Society for shortening up my overly lengthy title here. So my objective today is to provide a brief overview of just some of the factors that I see as impacting the viability of a lunar economy. And briefly, I just want to take a moment to explain what I mean by sustainability. Unfortunately, the term sustainability is increasingly becoming little more than a slogan. In the context of my talk, sustainability simply means that over time, there is positive economic growth to the extent that lunar industry continues to attract fresh capital, and that the people involved, the people on the moon, will be experiencing a continual improvement in their quality of life. I make several assumptions in my talk that I'm kind of taking as givens. And the first assumption is that there is a market for lunar products, and that the market will be large enough and have sufficient growth potential to make a lunar economy practical over the longer term. My second assumption is that a mining dependent or extractive industry dependent lunar economy, because of its unique situation and the associated degree of technology requirements, is not going to fall prey to the same set of scenarios or circumstances that make a country's dependence on extractive industries a bad play here on Earth. And in the table on the right, I've got a list of the 25 economies that are most dependent on extractive industries today. And you won't find any OECD countries on the list, or any G20 countries for that matter. I was watching a talk by Jerry Kuczynski some years ago. He's a big proponent of lunar helium-3. But the point that stuck with me was his contention that you could have stacks of gold ingots just sitting on the moon, and you would lose money if you went there and brought them back to Earth. And his talk was at a time when gold was basically selling for $10,000 a pound. Now, in researching another talk I did about space globalization, I was looking into transportation costs, and I, a nobody, can at list price ship water from New York to Cairo, Egypt at a cost of 18 cents a pound. So that is a huge cost differential that we have to address. So the biggest assumption I'm making here is that the size of that transportation cost difference can be countered by a productive cost difference in the other direction that's favoring the moon. A straightforward assumption that I make, and it's certainly a reasonable assumption, is that our existing economic models apply equally well to non-Earth economies. So what that means is that communism doesn't work here on the Earth, so it's not going to work on the moon. Finally, I'm assuming that there is going to be overlap in how factors are used, and those are factors that will impact the space economy. And I'm assuming that not only is how these factors are used is reconcilable, but that they'll be reconciled in such a way that will have a positive rather than a negative impact on total economic activity. So in other words, I'm kind of assuming that we're always going to sell low and buy high. Now, Mars Society recently held a Mars city-state design competition, and I was a member of a team that entered that competition, and we did complete our submission on time. But there were times I got really kind of riled up by some of the policy desires on the part of some of the folks on the economics team, because I saw these policies as being really detrimental to the economic success of our system. But what I want to call your attention to is the premise put forward by the Mars Society in the contest. In a nutshell, they're implying that Earth will be the only market for Martian exports, and that the Martian economy will have to be as self-reliant as possible. So let's think about what that means. With globalization, we have a system of trade that integrates the world's economies and leverages the system of comparative advantages and enhances the value of mass markets, which is what makes today's economy possible. The system called for in the Mars competition, and this seems to me to be an all too commonly held view by space activists, is what I would call for as being an autarkic sort of system, or even a mercantilistic type of system that would ultimately result in a lower standard of living for all concerned. Now, as an aside, if our goal is to create fully automated space economies where we're relying exclusively on robotics for their productive capabilities, and there's essentially no human population, then you can argue that the mercantilistic approach makes sense, and autarky would certainly be substantially easier to achieve. Now, the desire to be self-sufficient is understandable, but when someone makes that statement about being self-sufficient, we have to ask the question, why? How does that system advantage itself by being self-sufficient? And if autarky is considered to be a bad thing here on the Earth, why would it be a good thing for someone who wants to live on the moon? Now, the most complex challenge, I think, is probably going to be the governance challenge, because governance really defines the rules under which a system is going to operate. And how you govern an economy and a system has a huge impact on whether or not that economic system will be successful. So for me, private property rights really do need to be provided, because property is an asset, not just for its physical value, but as an asset that can be bought, sold, traded, and against which you can borrow money. In short, it's a fungible asset. The Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto wrote extensively about this, and he's the guy who coined the term dead capital, or dead space. But it's a phrase he came up with to describe an asset that cannot easily be bought, sold, valued, or most importantly, used as collateral for raising additional capital. He saw this as being a brake on economic development and viewed it as an important contributing factor to the high levels of poverty that we're seeing in a number of countries. Now, with respect to lunar and asteroid mining, one thing we've got to consider is the size of the market in terms of demand for the resources that will be mined. And we're particularly going to have to focus on the nature of Earth's demand and how that demand is distributed. So for me, the question is, how does the scale of space mining operations that would be necessary to cover the cost of those operations align with the total demand and consequently the market size that would be necessary to cover those costs? So tied in with the size of a market is the question of both the availability of substitute goods as well as that of competing suppliers. And the list on the right is a list of typically what asteroid mining folks say that they're going to be going after. And you'll note there's a lot of overlap with what lunar mining folks say that they are going to be going after. So now what happens to your economy if your customers find an alternative supplier for your dominant good? So something to be considered in this is something called factor price equalization. And what that means is that the price of a commodity, or any commodity for that matter, given that it's supplied by multiple entities, the prices are going to converge towards a common price. So what happens to you if your costs are greater than the convergent price? Another consideration for a lunar economy is how diversified it's going to be. An economy that produces only a limited variety of goods as measured by an economic diversification index is more vulnerable than an economy that is well diversified. The table on the right illustrates this by listing both the most and least complex economic systems using Harvard's Economic Complexity Index. So I would ask you to just kind of take a look at the nations that have a high rating versus the nations that have a low ranking on this index. Now, I recently saw a cartoon. It had a couple of robots standing around the office water cooler, and the office was clearly empty of people. And one of the robots is saying to the other, they call it flu season, which is my intro to this chart, which compares the advantages of a robotic workforce over that of a human workforce. So it's a given that it's going to take significant capital to build the infrastructure needed to keep people alive and happy on the moon. That means that the value that these people are going to have to add to the lunar economy will have to be larger than the value of the output that could have been realized if that same capital was used to create productive output in terms of, let's say, automated mining, automated factories. Now, if you look at the Earth's advanced economies, you're going to see that productivity growth and a rising standard of living are really tied to an increasing reliance on capital. Uh, a business requires capital to purchase that next generation of equipment that allows it to more efficiently use its inputs in order to create a given amount of output. So one example that strikes me as particularly relevant is that of assembly automation. And in at least one study that was done, it's been estimated that the assembly automation applied to the 1979 SPS design reference system, which was at that time, or for a long time, the most thoroughly examined solar power satellite system. Uh, Automating the assembly has reduced the cost factor for that system by an order of 20 or so, which is very significant. And you may recall that Gerard O'Neill's rationale for building the Island 1 space colony is that the inhabitants of that colony would be employed in the construction of a solar power satellite or a system of solar power satellites. So it's a given that to build an industry or a business, you need capital. Capital is in limited supply, and it's going to flow to those investments that minimize risk and maximize payoff. So a key question here is, will lunar industries have what it takes to get or to attract, I should say, the investment capital that they will need to build and grow their industry? So this is an idealized diagram I created that offers up a vision of the sort of space-based economic system that we space advocates have long dreamed of. We want this to work. The challenge is with the how of it. It really is a quite complex equation, and it's for sure that there's a high degree of uncertainty on the value associated with the many parameters that compose this equation. And I'm sure that there are quite a few parameters that we are, as of yet at this time, we're unaware of them and what impact that they may have on the system. So revisiting that trade model diagram, regardless of which model you choose to go with, lunar industry is going to be competing with both Earth industries and other space industries, competing for customers, whether your competition is the asteroid miners or its zero-G space manufacturing facilities. Some way is going to have to be found to have these moon industries be competitive, and not just competitive, but successful. So that concludes my talk, because I wanted to make sure that I left quite a bit of time for question and answer and hopefully dialogue with folks who have opted to attend this presentation. So thank you very much. Two of my email addresses are up here, and it'd be great if you check out either chicagospace.org for Chicago Society for Space Studies, particularly if you're in Illinois, or the National Space Society at space.nss.org. So thank you very much. I'll leave my screen share on in case anyone wants me to go back to a particular slide.
Oh, okay, Jim, it looks like we have the first question here in chat. I'll go ahead. It's from Calvin. I'll read it off for him. So, yeah. He asks, I'm curious, why did you pick L5 for your idealized diagram? I think it was a couple slides back, and not say L4 or L1, etc.
Because so many of the people who are space activists started out as members of the L5 Society. So, in fact, the National Space Society itself was formed by a merger of the National Space Institute and the L5 Society. And if you go on spacenss.org, I think we have a fairly complete archive out there of all the old L5 newsletters that went out. So it'll give you a real insight into what space activists were doing, let's say 50 years ago. So hopefully that answered your question. The country that is most economically closed is North Korea. Yes, and I particularly love that satellite, that nighttime satellite view from space. South Korea is brilliantly lit up. China is pretty well lit up as well. And then there's this big black hole between the two that would lead you to believe that South Korea must be an island. Since it's surrounded by ocean on 3 sides, you would think it's surrounded by ocean on all 4 sides.
Okay, we have another question here from Benjamin. I am of the opinion that we are so far out from lunar, Martian, asteroid materials processing, etc., being anywhere close to competing with Earth, that I think the first colonist settlers will need to provide economic value trade with Earth in the form of intellectual property, technological development. Well, what are your thoughts there?
In one of the talks I have, and I thought about included it in this talk, it's basically a set of headlines from various space news publications from the ancient past of 2017 that were claiming that by 2020, asteroid mining would be a multi-trillion-dollar industry. Now, when you think about that, to go from 0 to multiple trillions in 3 years is, on the face of it, highly implausible. And it's definitely been shown to not be true. The thing is, the startup costs are going to be really high, whether it's lunar mining or asteroid mining, particularly if you're talking about mining for metals. And my opinion is that colonization is going to have to be shown to be successful and attract a very large number of people who are, depending on what they're doing, they're able to do something to pay their way to live in either a lunar environment or a space colony environment. And it will be that outer space demand for building materials and other consumables that will allow moon mining industries, or I'll just say moon industries and asteroid-based industries, to build up to the point where the market size is large enough that they can begin to bring the costs down and create something of a virtuous cycle, so that as cost goes down, more activity takes place, which will hopefully drive costs down even further. Benjamin, was that a sufficient answer, or is there more you would like me to hear or like to hear on that? Tourism, I see that Dana Carson's mentioned about tourism. That could be the critical initial driving factor in all of this, because that gives you a totally commercial starting point at which entrepreneurs can get their feet wet in space businesses that are based in space rather than in space businesses that are, let's say, based here on the Earth and are supplying services. Is asteroid mining economically feasible? You know what? It's economically feasible if the price of the relevant materials rises high enough here on the Earth, or if we have Earth orbiting facilities of sufficient size and demand that it's actually cheaper to get them materials from asteroids versus the surface of the Earth, particularly if you're talking about large volumes. I'm particularly skeptical that there will ever be an Earth market for any mined ores from space unless it's something that is not native to Earth. And the only example of something that like that comes to mind is going to be the helium-3 that I mentioned in that one presentation by Jerry Kosinski, who was one of those guys teaching the space classes up at University of Wisconsin in Madison. So he was very much a proponent of space development, but he thought it was unreasonable for people to be claiming that we would be mining nickel, iron, other such things on the moon and transporting them back here to Earth. Jim, what is one piece of national legislation that you believe we should make an election demand for candidates? You know, thank you, Daryl. And hi, by the way. You know, the thing is, space ranks high on my list of priorities, as well as I assume on the list of priorities of the folks here. But we're a vanishingly small minority, and politicians have limited bandwidth. I mean, come on, everything is limited. You only got so much time, and we only have so much money to donate to campaigns. So I really doubt that space will make it as an issue in this campaign. If it is an issue, it's going to probably be on potentially a call to cancel Artemis. So because now that project has been tainted by Trump, so the Democrats will, I'm going to assume, automatically oppose it. In fact, there was some legislation recently introduced in the House that is calling for some pretty big cuts because frankly, there are a lot of other spending priorities and it's a question of prioritization. So we've had some legislation, I think, that is pointing in the right direction. I would say near term, you know, extension of the liability limits for space tourism companies is important to giving them that type of financial security to at least get the industry off the ground and begin flying paying customers so that they can go through the learning experience and figuring out, okay, what works, what doesn't work, what can we do to improve things?
Okay, I guess, yeah, we're coming up on the top of the hour here. So I think we'll go ahead and end it there, Jim. Do you mind if any of the attendees want to continue the conversation? Do you mind if they contact you at your email addresses here on the final slide?
Either of these two, Jim Plaxco at chicagospace.org, or you can use my NSS email, jim.plaxco@nss.org, or you can contact me at two of them. But these two would be best. And just I would say, indicate in the subject line that it's a question pertaining to the Lunar Development Conference so that I can, quickly identify it.
All right.
Thank
All
you
right.
very much. And if you're all not members of National Space Society and the Moon Society and the Mars Society and Chicago Space, we're free. We don't have membership dues. So thank you very much, everyone. And I hope you're able to stick around and enjoy the rest of the conference, both today and tomorrow.
All right. Great. Thank you. Well,
Thank
thank
you.
you. Thank you, Jim. And I guess have a good afternoon, folks.